Beyond the words we speak lies a universe of meaning, locked behind barriers of language. Imagine a key, a universal translator for all languages, human and beyond. What understanding might we find within our own species and in the whispers of the wind, the songs of the whales? Prepare to listen, as never before.
Okay, so you know that feeling right when you're like really curious about something and you just want to like get right to the heart of it without getting bogged down in all the little details?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what we're all about here. And today we're diving deep into this piece that you sent us called The Augmented Babble, Humanity's Echo in the Voices of the Animal Kingdom.
Very intriguing title.
Yeah, and it gets right to like this really radical idea of what if we had an augmented reality interface that could translate animal communication right into like human language?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating concept, isn't it? Just thinking about like stepping outside and instead of just hearing the sounds of nature, suddenly being able to understand what those sounds actually mean.
Totally. And that's really what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. Like, what are the biggest and most interesting implications of this idea for, for us as humans and for the whole animal kingdom?
Exactly, because it's not just about understanding, a dog's bark or a cat's meow. It's about this like whole other layer of reality opening up to us, a world of communication that's been happening all around us that we've been largely oblivious to.
Right. So let's like break down this core concept a little bit. I mean, we all kind of intuitively know that animals communicate, right? Like if you've ever had a pet, you're constantly interpreting their behavior, trying to figure out what they're trying to tell you.
Yeah, exactly. Like a dog wagging its tail or a cat rubbing against your leg. There's meaning there, even if we don't fully understand it.
Right. But this augmented babble idea is taking that intuition and like amplifying it with technology, right? So imagine an AR interface that's providing real-time translations, maybe through like sounds that we hear or images that are overlaid on our vision or even like tactile sensations.
I haven't thought about the tactile element. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like, imagine feeling a vibration on your skin that corresponds to, like, a bird's alarm call or something like that.
Sure.
It's like directly plugging into the sensory world of another species.
And the piece you sent highlights some pretty amazing examples of what kind of communication we might be able to access. Like, think about bird territorial disputes. Suddenly you're walking through the park and you're hearing these, like, intricate arguments happening overhead.
Or like family members greeting each other, like you hear these little chirps and you realize it's like a bird parent welcoming its offspring back to the nest.
Exactly. And then there's the example of frogs croaking in a pond. But now you're not just hearing noise, you're hearing discussions about like where the best insects are or like mating calls echoing across the water.
And then you get to like the really profound stuff, like being able to understand a dog's specific need for help or deciphering whale songs into accounts of their migrations or even like requests for assistance with things like barnacle infestations.
Right. It's like suddenly having access to these like ancient stories and complex social dynamics that have been going on right under our noses.
So I guess the big question for the listener, right, is like, what would it actually feel like to tap into this constant flow of information? Like imagine walking through that park and instead of just the sounds of nature, you're also hearing the intricate social lives of all the creatures around you.
Yeah, and it's not just about the sounds, right? It's about this like whole other layer of meaning being added to our sensory experience.
Yeah.
Like that pond isn't just a pond anymore. It's an active marketplace of information about food and potential mates.
Yeah, it's really kind of mind-bending when you think about it. But I mean, one thing that the source brings up right away is the potential for like sensory overload and mental fatigue.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like our brains have evolved to filter out so much information, and suddenly being bombarded with the detailed inner lives of countless creatures could be totally overwhelming.
It's like trying to pay attention to every conversation happening in a crowded room at the same time, right? And it's not just conversations, like every chirp, every rustle, every whine potentially carrying a significant meaning.
Exactly. And, it makes you wonder, like, would we even be able to function in that kind of environment? Or would we just shut down completely?
Right. But the text also makes this really important point about the adaptability of the human brain. Like, we're incredibly good at learning to filter out noise, right? Like, think about living in a city. You eventually just tune out the constant sirens and traffic.
That's true. We do have a remarkable ability to adapt to new environments and new kinds of sensory input.
So maybe we would develop like new cognitive mechanisms to handle this influx of information, maybe even a form of like interspecies multitasking,
Right.
where you could selectively focus on the animal communications that are relevant to you at any given moment.
Yeah, like being able to tune in to the birdsong in your garden while filtering out the chatter of the squirrels in the trees.
Right, or maybe you could even like switch between different animal channels depending on what you're interested in at the moment.
It's really fascinating to think about the possibilities, but I do think the potential for cognitive burnout would be a serious concern. I mean, how much information can our brains realistically process before they just start to overload?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it connects to this other big question that the text raises, which is like, what are the emotional consequences of all of this? What happens to our empathy when we're suddenly exposed to the suffering of so many creatures?
Right, because it's not all going to be happy, chirping birds and friendly whale songs.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
There's going to be a lot of fear, pain, hunger, all of that stuff just pouring into our awareness.
Exactly. And the source suggests that this constant awareness of the challenges faced by other sentient beings could have like a really profound impact on our values. Maybe it would lead us to prioritize the well-being of all life forms in a way that we never have
It
before.
could be like a huge shift in perspective, right? Like suddenly realizing that our actions have consequences not just for ourselves and other humans, but for like the entire web of life.
Right. And it could even lead to like concrete changes in our behavior. Like maybe we would become more mindful of our impact on the environment or more compassionate towards animals in general.
Yeah, but the text also wisely brings up the potential for the opposite reaction, like emotional numbing. What if we just shut down emotionally as a way of coping with this constant onslaught of suffering?
Yeah, that's kind of a dark thought, isn't it? Like building a wall around our empathy just to survive in this new reality. And then there's this whole other layer of complexity, which is like the potential blurring of reality.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting one.
But the source gives this great example of a sunny day that we perceive as pleasant, but at the same time, the birds are communicating alarm about an approaching storm that we can't even detect yet.
Yeah, suddenly our human perception of reality isn't the only valid one. It's being contradicted by the lived experience of these other creatures.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, like, how much are we missing right now? How much of the world are we just not equipped to perceive?
And then if you take that a step further, what happens when different species have fundamentally different interpretations of the same event? Like, what if what we perceive as a beautiful sunset is actually a signal of danger to a certain kind of insect?
Yeah, it could lead to some serious cognitive dissonance, right? Like
Right.
questioning our own understanding of the most basic things.
And I think it also raises questions about our own inherent biases.
Yeah.
Like, how much are we projecting our own human perspectives onto these animal communications?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it makes me think about the potential for dependency on this AR interface.
Yeah.
Like, what if we become so reliant on technology to understand the world around us that we lose our own natural abilities?
Oh, absolutely. Like,
Yeah.
it's kind of like relying on GPS navigation all the time. Eventually, you lose your own sense of direction.
Right. And in this case, it's not just about finding your way around physically. It's about losing your ability to connect with nature on a fundamental level.
Like, we might forget how to read the subtle cues in animal behavior, how to interpret the signs of a changing ecosystem.
And, one thing I was thinking about is the potential impact on human communication. Like, what if animal communication is perceived as more direct or even more honest because it's not filtered through all the complexities of human language?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Like, maybe we would start to see human language as more flawed or even deceptive in comparison.
And maybe that could lead to changes in how we communicate with each other. Like maybe we would become more literal, more straightforward in our interactions.
Or maybe it would just highlight the unique beauty and complexity of human language even more, with all of its nuances and layers of meaning.
So we've talked a lot about the individual level, right? Like how this technology might change our personal experiences and perceptions. But the source also gets into the really big picture stuff, like how this could reshape society as a whole.
Right, like what are the social and political implications of suddenly being able to understand animal communication?
And I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is the idea of a new social contract between humans and animals.
Yes, exactly. And the source specifically talks about how understanding animal social structures could really challenge our assumptions about intelligence and social organization.
Like maybe we discover that the intricate social dynamics of a beehive are more complex and efficient than our own bureaucratic systems.
Or maybe we realize that species that we've always considered relatively simple actually have really sophisticated forms of communication and social cooperation.
Right. It's like suddenly realizing that we've been underestimating the intelligence of other life forms for
And
centuries.
that could lead to some pretty radical changes in how we view our place in the world, right? Maybe we would start to see ourselves as just one part of a much larger interconnected web of life.
And the source even talks about the possibility of interspecies collaboration on issues like resource management and environmental protection.
Like, imagine being able to negotiate fishing quotas directly with whale populations, or partnering with bird species on reforestation efforts.
Yeah, that would be amazing. It's like a true planetary partnership.
But of course, it's not all going to be smooth sailing, right? The text also acknowledges the potential for new conflicts to arise.
Yeah, I mean, differing needs and perspectives are inevitable. Like, what happens when whale communities communicate that our fishing practices are decimating their food sources, and the human fishing industry resists those claims?
Exactly. We would need entirely new ways of resolving conflicts and mediating between the needs of different species.
And the potential expansion of animal rights movements is another huge factor to consider.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we can directly understand animal suffering through their own communication, it becomes much harder to ignore.
Right. It's like that famous quote, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. Well, imagine if they had audio feeds broadcasting the cries of the animals inside.
Yeah, it would be really difficult to justify our current practices in the face of that kind of direct understanding.
And the source even raises the possibility of reevaluating the concept of personhood to include non-human beings.
Which would have huge implications for everything from law to ethics to our very understanding of what it means to be human.
And the text even goes so far as to speculate on new forms of governance that incorporate the perspectives of the entire biosphere.
Like, imagine having designated animal representatives participating in environmental policy discussions or even voting in elections.
It sounds crazy, but it's also kind of brilliant, right? Like finally giving a voice to the voiceless.
And it raises all sorts of interesting questions about what democracy even means in a multi-species context.
So we've talked about the individual impacts, the social impacts, but I think this whole conversation also leads us into some really complex ethical territory.
Oh, yeah, it's a total ethical minefield. And the source refers to it as the ethical labyrinth, which I think is a very apt description.
Because there are so many different paths to consider and so many potential pitfalls along the way.
Like, one of the first questions you encounter is the issue of sentience. Like, if we can now understand the subjective experience of a fly or a fish, does that mean we have to extend our ethical considerations to them as well?
Right. It's like suddenly swatting a fly becomes a much more weighty moral decision.
And then there's the question of intervention in natural processes. Like, if we understand that an animal is in distress, do we have an obligation to help even if it disrupts the natural ecological balance?
Like the example of the whale with the barnacles, right? Helping the whale seems like the compassionate thing to do, but what are the ripple effects throughout the entire marine ecosystem?
Exactly. We might think we're doing good, but we could actually be causing more harm in the long run.
And can we even be sure that we're interpreting animal communication correctly? Like, the source brings up the issue of honesty in animal communication. Like, are there forms of deception or manipulation that we might be misinterpreting?
Oh, yeah, that's a really important point. Like, an animal's distress call might actually be a lure to attract prey, or a mating display might involve exaggerated signals of strength or fitness.
And our tendency to anthropomorphize doesn't help, right? We're always projecting our own human emotions and motivations onto animals.
Exactly. And that could lead to some really big misunderstandings and potentially harmful interventions.
And then there's the whole ethical dimension of controlling access to the AR technology itself. Like, who gets to use it and how do we prevent it from being used for exploitation?
Yeah, that's a huge concern. I mean, it's easy to imagine this technology being used in factory farms to further optimize production methods, or in the entertainment industry to create even more spectacular animal shows.
And what about the animal's right to privacy? Like, do they have a right to their own communicative space free from our constant eavesdropping and interpretation?
Absolutely. I mean, we as humans value our privacy and the ability to communicate freely without being monitored. And animals deserve that same trust.
Right. And it's not just about privacy. It's also about the potential for disrupting their natural communication patterns. Like, what if our constant presence and interpretation starts to interfere with their social dynamics or their mating rituals?
So it's not just a matter of developing the technology. It's also about developing ethical frameworks for how we use it.
Exactly. And that's a really big challenge because this is such uncharted territory.
It's like we're on the verge of discovering a whole new continent, and we have no idea what we're going to find there.
And that brings us to this really profound question that the source explores, which is like, how might this entire experience transform humanity as a species?
Yeah, it's the ultimate thought experiment, right?
Yeah.
What happens to us when we finally break down the communication barrier between ourselves and the rest of the animal kingdom?
And the source talks about the potential for moving beyond anthropocentrism, like finally shedding this idea that humans are the center of the universe.
Right, and it could lead to a much more humble and interconnected view of our place in the world.
Like maybe we finally start to see ourselves as just one part of a vast and complex ecosystem rather than the dominant species.
And gaining insight into the subjective experiences of other species could change our very understanding of consciousness itself.
Yeah, like maybe consciousness isn't this unique human attribute, but rather a spectrum of experience that manifests in countless different forms throughout the animal kingdom.
And the impact on our religious and spiritual beliefs could be huge. I mean, imagine discovering evidence of complex inner lives and even basic forms of morality in animals.
It would really challenge our traditional anthropocentric religious frameworks, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And it could lead to a more inclusive spiritual understanding that encompasses all sentient beings on the planet.
Wow. I mean, that's a really profound thought. And on a slightly lighter note, the source also explores how this ability to understand animal communication could lead to new and unexpected forms of artistic expression.
Oh, yeah, the possibilities are really exciting to think about. Like imagine musicians collaborating with whales or painters working with elephants.
It would be like a whole new renaissance of art and creativity inspired by the natural world.
And imagine the transformation of storytelling animal characters could become so much richer and more nuanced.
Right. Instead of just being anthropomorphic projections, they could be based on a genuine understanding of their motivations and their unique perspectives on the world.
And of course, it could deepen the bonds we share with our companion animals. Like imagine having a real conversation with your dog or cat.
But I think one of the most important areas where this technology could have a real impact is in the field of conservation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine being able to understand the threats facing endangered species directly from their own communication.
Or being able to monitor their population dynamics with unprecedented accuracy.
And even getting feedback from entire ecosystems on how environmental changes are affecting them.
It's like being able to take the pulse of the planet.
And imagine hearing directly from animals about the impact of human activities. Like a whale vocalizing its distress due to plastic ingestion.
Yeah.
Or a bird calling out an alarm about the loss of its nesting grounds.
Yeah, that could be incredibly powerful and motivating.
It could lead to a complete shift in our conservation strategies towards more targeted and collaborative approaches.
And it could also change how we think about the economic value of nature.
Right, like recognizing the intrinsic value of the ecological services that animals provide, like pollination by bees or carbon sequestration by whales.
That could lead to entirely new economic models that prioritize the long-term well-being of ecosystems.
And it could inform more sustainable practices in industries like fishing, agriculture, and forestry.
And imagine the revolution in ecotourism, like
Yeah.
actually being able to understand and respect the animals we're observing.
It would be a completely different experience, wouldn't it?
But of course, none of this is possible without some major technological breakthroughs.
Right. The source talks about the technological imperative. Like we need major advancements in artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, wearable technology, all of that stuff.
It's almost like we're talking about creating a network of interconnected consciousness across the entire planet.
Which is a pretty mind-blowing concept when you think about it.
But even if we can overcome these technological hurdles, there are still some major perils of translation to consider.
Yeah, like the risk of misinterpreting animal communication or imposing our own human biases onto their signals.
And the possibility of unintentionally disrupting their natural behaviors through our attempts to communicate.
So we have to be really careful and really humble in our approach.
Absolutely. And I think the source sums it up really well when it talks about the potential for humanity transformed. Like, this whole experience could fundamentally change who we are as a species.
It could make us more compassionate, more connected to the natural world, more aware of our place in the web of life.
But it could also lead to unintended and even catastrophic consequences. Like, what if we unlock some knowledge that we're not ready for? Or what if we become so reliant on technology that we lose our connection to the natural world?
So it's both exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, it's like standing at the edge of a vast unknown and we have no idea what's waiting for us on the other side.
And that's what makes it so compelling, right?
Yeah.
It's the ultimate adventure.
So we've explored a lot of ground in this deep dive, but I think the most important takeaway for the listener is this. Like, we're on the cusp of something truly extraordinary.
The possibility of understanding the voices of the animal kingdom is no longer science fiction. It's becoming a real possibility.
And that raises some really big questions for all of us. Like, what does it mean to live in a world where humans are no longer the only ones with a voice?
And how will we rise to the challenge of communicating with and understanding other species in a way that is both ethical and beneficial for all?
So we want to hear from you, the listener. What are your thoughts and perspectives on this incredible possibility? What would it mean to you to be able to understand the voices of the animal kingdom? And what responsibilities would come with that ability?
This is a conversation that is just beginning, and your voice is a vital part of it.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we look forward to continuing this exploration together.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Our podcast AI voices are courtesy of Notebook LM and 11 Labs.
The humans and AIs of the AI Plus Roundtable, thank you for joining us on this exploration into uncharted territories.
We invite you to visit our Substack blog at airoad.substack.com for a much deeper text-based exploration on the topic you have just listened to.
We thank the humans of Innovation Toronto and our 12 AI colleagues, Copilot, ChatGPT, Claude, Cohere, DeepSeek, 11 Labs, Gemini, Grok, Llama, Mistral, Notebook LM, Perplexity, for co-creating the more in-depth and expansive document that this podcast overview episode is based on.